The Syrian refugee crisis has obviously been a big issue in the election campaign, but how's it resonating with the Canadian people? Not like some of the party leaders would have you expect or would like people to react to it. In fact, the latest poll from Ipsos shows that Stephen Harper is coming out ahead of the other guys. Is that correct? Darrell Bricker here with me, by the way.
Yes. In fact, we find that a plurality of people that we interviewed, about 38%, say that they prefer his approach to this particular issue.
So he doesn't have a majority, but he's beating out both Tom Mulcair's idea of 10,000 by the end of the year and Justin Trudeau's 25,000 by the end of the year.
Right. So what we've discovered is that, we've moved off of that period in which people were really focused on the question of, compassion about what happened, that event that happened a couple of weeks ago. And they're now getting into the practicalities of what it might mean to bring a lot of Syrian refugees to Canada. And they've got a few questions. So it's really not so much about the absolute number, but about the process itself.
This is a civil war that Canada, most of the Western countries have stayed out of because we couldn't find a good guy. Do you think that's playing into it? The fact that people know, every side has some questionable bits about it?
Well, that may be part of it, but I think the other part is that we've moved from images of the tragedy that was related to the Syrian refugees now to the problems that are associated with actually accepting more refugees. So,
people at fences, riots, arguing with police.
Right. So it's starting to look, I would say, from the pictures that people are seeing, to look to be more problematic. But also there still is quite a concern among Canadians about security. They know that the source of terrorism in the world is basically coming out of that region, and they want to be convinced that we're still applying the security measures that are necessary to make sure that no terrorists come to Canada.
All right. In the middle of the campaign that we're having right now, you've got two major party leaders saying, pull the troops out now. We don't need to be part of a combat mission. And yet, you found 57% support, that's 21% strongly, 36% somewhat, support increasing Canada's military support in the region to fight the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, which has helped cause the refugee crisis. Is that surprising? That's much higher than, if it was just Stephen Harper supporters, that number would be much lower.
Right. I mean, Stephen Harper right now, in terms of voter support, is getting about 30%. 57 is obviously a very strong majority. But we've seen consistent support among Canadians for the mission against ISIL. In fact, we've seen it in the 80s in terms of support. This question was asking about increasing it rather than just maintaining it, so it was a bit more of a test. But as you can see, Canadians do think that the military engagement is important in this region, and they do support it.
They also support increased humanitarian aid. They're okay with refugees, but there's caveats there.
Right, and the main caveat is about security. Whether or not the process of admitting refugees will require us to reduce our focus on keeping security in terms of making sure that people who are coming here are not committed to some sort of a terrorist agenda. Now, granted, we may be talking about very small numbers of people who would be affected by that, but the truth is that this issue of terrorism is really bitten deep in Canada, and it's one of the things that the opposition leaders don't acknowledge that a lot of Canadians really have a strong opinion about.
Well, I keep hearing from anyone that brings up the security issue, well, that's just fear-mongering. Obviously, the Canadian public thinks differently.
Well, if they thought it was fear-mongering, we wouldn't be getting numbers like this. Sometimes fear-mongering, or what is interpreted as fear-mongering, is actually real fear. People really do have concerns about security in this country. They are very concerned about terrorism. They did live through what happened on Parliament Hill here last October. They do believe that there are serious existential threats to Canadian security domestically, and they don't want to enhance that by bringing in people that have not been properly screened.
Is there a disconnect between the media that's covering this on the election campaign and the Canadian public? Because I've been out at the events. If there's a question about Syrian refugees, it's why won't you let in more? How fast can you let in more? Why is the other guy so mean for not letting in more? It seems to be agenda-driven questioning in terms of, well, everyone thinks this way. It's not a question. Like, there isn't a critical thinking element to it. It just seems to be, well, of course, everyone thinks this way.
Well, we're sitting in Ottawa. I mean, Ottawa is not exactly representative of the national discussion on very many issues these days. And in fact, John Ibbotson and I wrote a book called The Big Shift, in which we focus in one chapter on the question of the media. And the real question about the media is how narrow their focus is and what their agenda is. And it's very much what we call in the book a Laurentian elite agenda, where it's a notion of the country that's pretty much out of date. Canadians have moved on. There's a new winning coalition in this country, and it doesn't necessarily hearken to those issues that were so important to those people who used to run it. And there's this huge disconnect. And we saw it on not only this issue, we also saw it on, for example, the Idle No More issue on Native issues, in which the Ottawa media was completely out of touch with what was happening in terms of Canadian public opinion on that issue. I wouldn't say it's as extreme this time around, but certainly it's of a kind. Certainly, what we're talking about in the mainstream media about how the Canadian public thinks about this, or what the Canadian public's values are relative to this issue, are not representative of what Canadians are telling us on our surveys.
All right. Well, of course, you can read the full results of the poll at TheRebel.Media, and you can probably even find a link to the book there, The Big Shift. Worth reading. Darrell Bricker, thanks as always.
Always a pleasure, Brian. Thank you.